And there you go. And I'm just gonna, we have quite a few people signed up, so I'm just gonna give it a minute. Let other people log in. We're having some people log in still. And with that, I would like to welcome you to our winners speaker series. I'm Mike Bosco. I'm a project manager with Mid-Columbia Fisheries. And with me is Stephen Irakawa. He's our field lead, and he's going to be handling the technology for us tonight. So a little bit about Mid-Columbia Fisheries. We are a nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting and restoring wild salmonid populations and their habitats through restoration, protection, education, and community involvement throughout our region of central and south central Washington. We have some members of our staff and maybe our board here. If I can have everybody from Mid-Columbia maybe turn on the screens and give a wave. Thank you. But before we start, I want to just do a little bit of housekeeping. We're going to have time for question and answers after the presentation. But if you have questions and you want to get them asked, go ahead and type them into the chat, and I'm going to keep track of those. And I'm going to try to make sure I note those down so we can ask them at the end. If you feel like asking it on your own, feel free to jump in at the end, and we'll have everybody unmuted. You'll notice that you are muted now. We're keeping everybody muted just to keep the background noises out as as the presentations are going on. If you're on a phone dialing in, we're going to ask you to mute your phone. We can't do that from our side, so just to keep the background noises out. So this evening's talks is an overview on bull trout in the Yakima Basin. Bull trout are a charismatic apex predator that are important to aquatic ecosystems. Alex and Aimee are going to explain the biology of bull trout, the status of bull trout in the Yakima Basin, and a little bit about the current projects, including our bull trout task force that are being implemented to help reduce impacts to these bull trout. It's going to be my honor to introduce our speakers, Alex Conley and Aimee Taylor. Alex has been the executive director of the Yakima Basin Fish and Wildlife Recovery Board since 2006. He grew up poking around the woods and coast of New England and received an undergraduate degree in biology from Williams College in Massachusetts before moving west. Alex enjoys learning about complex landscapes and the human livelihoods they support, and strives to bring together technical experts, stakeholders, and policymakers to forge sound approaches to managing and restoring the river systems in the Yakima Basin. Aimee, one of ours, Aimee has been working with the bull trout with bull trout in the Yakima Basin since 2019, when she first joined Mid-Columbia Fisheries to be on the bull trout task force. She transitioned into a job with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for a couple of years and eventually completed her master's degree at Central Washington University in 2022. She's back with us, Mid-Columbia Fisheries, in a leadership role as the bull trout recovery coordinator and field lead of our bull trout task force. Prior to moving to Ellensburg, she worked several seasonal jobs collecting data on other threatened and endangered species of fish. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Alex and Aimee, and they're going to tell us all things bull trout. Thanks, guys.
All right, well, welcome all. And just want to confirm, are you seeing our title slide?
I could see it, Alex.
Okay, right. Well, you're getting a presentation today that's a partnership, and I hope the partnership on the presentation is reflective of broader partnerships. So I'm Alex Conley with the Yakima Basin Fish and Wildlife Recovery Board. I'll talk a little later about how we got engaged in bull trout work. And Aimee, I'll be presenting the first part and the end of it, and Aimee's going to present the bulk of the presentation between. Aimee works for Mid-Columbia, but we've had a great partnership now for quite a few years where we've been able to fund Mid-Columbia for a portion of someone's time to work to help us convene the Bull Trout working group. And I'll talk a little bit about that. It's been great to have Aimee there. We've had several different people in that role over the years, and Aimee's really bringing a ton to supporting it. It's great for us. We don't have the capacity to bring on a full-time person in that role. So to be able to work in partnership with Mid-Columbia and Aimee's been fantastic. So you'll hear from both of us over the course of this presentation. Get on the right window so it'll move. So Bull Trout. And I see some familiar names here. I also see a lot of names I don't know, which is awesome. So I'm assuming some of you know more about bull trout than I do, and others are just beginning. But bull trout, Latin name is Salvelinus confluentus. It is a char, so it's related to Arctic char, Dolly Varden, Eastern brook trout, all cold water species spread through northern North America. Bull trout really depend on the coldest of our streams to spawn and rear. They will move down into and feed and migrate in somewhat warmer waters, but the spawning and the youngest fish, they require water that is pretty darn cold, 12 degrees Celsius or less. So you're talking often in the 40s in Fahrenheit. They're also a long-lived repeat spawner. So unlike salmon, they're not going belly up after one time on the spawning grounds. They are spawning, they're dropping back down to feed. They may skip a year, they may come back the next year, but they'll be on the spawning grounds multiple times in their life as long as they survive between spawning seasons. And really diverse migratory life histories. So we certainly have bull trout that act like a little cutthroat trout, grow this big, have a few hundred small eggs, and their entire life history is up in a high tributary. We have fish that grow a lot bigger. You'll see a lot of bull trout that are getting into the 20, 30 plus centimeter range, who are migrating and feeding in places where the fish they feed on are more abundant, but then always coming back to these headwater streams to spawn. So if they migrate down into a lake, which we see a lot in the Yakima Basin, we call them adfluvial. If they're migrating into a river system, they're fluvial. And we do also, not so much in the Yakima, but certainly other places in their range, see anadromous bull trout. So bull trout that actually drop into the saltwater like a salmon and then come back up to spawn. I mentioned that they prey on other fish. They'll certainly eat insects and other food in the stream, especially as juveniles, but they really are. They're a fish eater. They're fairly voracious. This earned them a bad rep for a lot of years because we've always had the sense that my friend's enemy is my enemy. So bull trout had a long time where we treated them as a trash fish because they were going to eat our salmon and our trout, fish that we cared about. They co-evolved. There is nowhere where we had seen bull trout drive other species to extirpation. They're a part of the ecosystem. And one thing I think you'll find, while some people still call them a trash fish, and that's died hard, they were listed as threatened in 1998, which put a lot more attention on them as a listed species. Not only what do we do to save the fish, but how will this listing impact other economic interests? We've got a lot more attention on them. As we did so, I think one thing everyone who's been out working with bull trout has discovered, they're charismatic. You get out into a little headwater river, sometimes you're in a pocket 6 inches deep after you've dived under a willow, and suddenly there's these big colorful fish spawning together. You see them up close in shallow water in a way you see almost no other fish. I don't think there's anyone that's been on a bull trout red survey and gotten into it and said, dang, these are cool fish. That's just a quick intro to bull trout. Now, when it's the salmon recovery world, we often get asked, well, you have to do anything different than in salmon, or is this just another thing that needs the same things for salmon recovery? And the answer is, yeah, what's good for salmon is good for bull trout, but, and the buts are, the bull trout really are in those coldest, highest waters that may be more marginal for a lot of salmon, and that even where they overlap, they're pushed into that highest part of the watershed. And many of our bull trout populations are isolated in areas inaccessible to salmon, either from changes in the river systems since they were first established, natural changes, or especially in the Yakima Basin, when we built dams. The salmon don't get above the dams and the bull trout are all in the headwaters above the dam. So we're looking in different places geographically. And even when they do overlap, bull trout are often facing other issues. Is that charismatic fish that you can find in small waters, they face a lot of harassment. There's been a lot of poaching. There've been a lot of fisheries type issues that have been less of our focus in salmon recovery a lot of the time. We haven't traditionally fished for salmon on the spawning ground, but have been a big issue for bull trout. So the issues aren't always the same. So I mentioned a few times they're up in that high part of the watershed. You think of the watershed as a continuum from smaller, colder streams, high up, low nutrients, the mid-sized rivers with more moderate temperatures, meandering channels, all the way down in the Yakima to the lower Yakima, where it's slow, warm, high nutrient bedrock channel. Bull trout and cutthroat are the top of the watershed. They overlap down into the rainbow, the spring chinook, the coho water, a little lower down, a little bigger. And then as you proceed lower and lower in the watershed, by the time you get to fall chinook, these are salmon that only survive because they're not there in the summer. They've already gone to the ocean. So we've got a continuum. We'll talk a little later about climate change, where you think about where the bull trout are. As we see climate change warming things, most places have a place to move. Bull trout are one of the ones that hits the wall, or rather a waterfall, the soonest. But we'll talk a bit about what that position in the watershed means for them in their future. So bull trout are found pretty widely in the lower 48 and even more widely up in Canada and up in parts of Alaska. What's listed is the lower 48 DPS is the right term, distinct population segment. So you can see here, it's broken into a number of recovery units. This coastal unit, the Klamath unit on its own, the Yakimas here, we're part of this big blue, the biggest recovery unit called Mid-Columbia, Upper Snake, including down into Nevada and the Jarbidge, and then the Upper Columbia headwaters and the little head of the St. Mary's, which mainly drains into Canada. So widespread species geographically. Even within our recovery unit, here's the Yakima Basin. You can see there are a lot of what are called core areas in the Mid-Columbia recovery unit, of which the Yakima is just one. You can see the Umatilla, the Selway out in Idaho, all the branches of the John Day, the Methow, all of these are core areas. So bull trout are fairly well distributed within that Mid-Columbia unit. But you get within any one of these core areas, the Yakima look big on the last page, but the bull trout are only spawning in these yellow patches. And sadly, this yellow patch we haven't seen spawning in since about 2006. We still have spawning going on in all the other yellow patches, but it's these little areas way up and high in the watersheds. And in the Yakima, this is where we put our 5 major storage dams. So you'll find that 9 out of our roughly 13 populations, there's some discussion how you count some of them, 9 of them are above dams, above Clay Island Dam, above Cochise Dam in Box Canyon and in the Cochise River, up in Gold Creek, up by Snoqualmie Pass, and then down here above Bumping, and then 3 populations all above Rimrock Dam in the Tieton system. So it looked like they were everywhere when I showed you that, Northwest region slide, but then when you get to where they are, they're in very isolated patches in those areas. So they're widespread and yet uncommon. So we have this uncommon fish that used to be called a trash fish. Before it was listed, it was our local WDFW biologists who really said, hey, we need to figure out where we have bull trout and what the trend is. So we saw a lot of local initiative with almost no funding to do electroshocking distribution surveys, to start walking the streams in the fall, to do red counts in really the late 80s. And as they figured out where bull trout was, they used that to adjust fishing regulations. As we saw that listing in 98, you saw the Forest Service paying more and more attention to how to manage its management to protect bull trout. You saw a focus on ESA protections in other areas. You saw more and more engagement by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. But this was still a tiny, tiny discussion around a fish that wasn't really on the big picture radar. When we came into the picture, we took on a slightly different role than what had been done before. So the Yakima Basin Fish and Wildlife Recovery Board, we're a nonprofit, but we're a weird nonprofit. We were created by local city, county, and tribal governments. We have a lot of different programs. What then I'll talk about here is our recovery planning program. And we've worked with the federal agencies to write recovery plans for listed species in the Yakima Basin. We were at first really focused on steelhead, working with NOAA Fisheries. But then once we got a lot of that done, there was a lot of interest in upping the game for bull trout conservation in the basin. And there are two places we got pulled in. And Yuki's on the phone. She was a key part of both of these back in the day. So she can jump in at any time too. But there was a bull trout working group that had met occasionally, originally convened by US Fish. And we really made a point of convening that group on a regular meeting schedule and getting that to where it really became the place to come to talk about what's going on with bull trout in the Yakima, identify priorities, talk about funding opportunities, review monitoring data. We played a convening role there, just helping set that table, using our conference room, being able to get the funding currently from the Department of Ecology to fund Aimee and her predecessors to do the nuts and bolts of leading this group. And one of the big priorities of this group became writing a plan, this Yakima Bull Trout Action Plan, that really said, what's going on with bull trout? What do we know? What do we wish we knew? What's limiting their populations? What are the threats we have to address for them to be able to thrive? And then what actions do we need to take to get there? So we put a lot of time with that bull trout working group and key partners and other agencies and nonprofits to get this plan and to get a solid list of actions. We updated that last in 2017 to 2018. And so we went from just coordinating discussion to having this set of actions. And Aimee's going to now take the next chunk of the presentation and talk about what those actions are. What are we actually doing now that we've got a lot more focus on bull trout in the basin?
Thank you, Alex. That was a really great introduction. I'm excited to talk about some of the bull trout recovery projects we have going on. And I'm going to start off with my personal favorite project because it's my baby. But that's the Bull Trout Task Force. And the Bull Trout Task Force is implemented by Mid-Columbia Fisheries Enhancement Group. And we focus on a lot of different things, but education and outreach is one of them. And in order to sort of reach the public and grow support for bull trout in our area, this means we have to go out and talk to people and teach them about bull trout, because a lot of people actually don't know what a bull trout is or have never seen one or have never even heard of them. So part of what we do is we go out to campgrounds in bull trout country and we set up a station and we give presentations and we teach campers about the bull trout. We teach them about threats and what's causing decline. And we also teach anglers about how to identify bull trout, because they look very similar to eastern brook trout, and to an untrained eye, one might harvest a bull trout accidentally thinking it's a brook trout. So that's a big part of it, is helping teach people how to identify them in case they're captured accidentally. And we also have fun activities for kids at these presentations to get them excited about things. Like we do coloring, we make buttons that say bull trout are cool, and send them off on the kids' backpacks so that kids at school can ask them about their pin, and then down here in this white tub, you can see at the bottom of the table, we collect aquatic insects from the stream and show kids what the base of the food chain looks like. These insects are what all of the juvenile fish, the juvenile bull trout and other fish eat while they're in the freshwater stream system. We also post informational signage in recreational areas where there might be bull trout. So this young man is reading one of our signs about rock dams, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a second. We also post signs about, again, how to identify bull trout and reminding folks that if they do catch a bull trout, that they need to put it back instead of harvest it. And then we get kind of cool one-off events. Like this one was at Central Washington University's event called Nature of Night. and bull trout are a nocturnal fish. So we were invited to come speak about them, and we shared a room with some of the other Mid-Columbia folks who were talking about beavers. And so it was kind of perfect because bull trout and beavers actually do have a place together in the ecosystem. And this was a really fun one to talk to people at. Bull Trout Task Force also acts as kind of boots on the ground labor, and we go out and take out recreational rock dams. So what you're seeing in the picture here is a channel spanning rock dam, actually not just one of them, but several. So you have here, and then another one way upstream. And these are a problem for fish like bull trout because it's a migratory species. Sorry. And fish can not pass these channel spanning rock dams. And so people build these just for fun. People are out in the rivers having a good time and often don't realize that when they're moving about in the habitat that they can be causing issues for fish. And so we go out, we talk to people, we take these things out, and these rocks are actually a lot bigger than they might look. So we get really strong over the summer when we're moving huge boulders around in the river. Here's another example of one of those things. This was on a bull trout spawning stream in an area where juvenile bull trout should be out migrating. So this was kind of like a little bridge that somebody made, and our friend Kelsey is happily destroying it. And then, like I said, we're sort of a boots on the ground labor force for a lot of the other bull trout recovery projects that I'm going to talk about next. And so here we have some of our Bull Trout Task Force staff helping assist U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in installing a pit tag antenna. So I'll talk more about pit tags as well, but these help us track movements of bull trout throughout the basin. Another really fun project that I want to talk about is implemented by the Yakima Nation, and they are doing a bull trout rescue, rear, and release program. So unfortunately, we have a couple streams in the upper Yakima Basin that are going dry every summer, and these streams are ones that adult bull trout move up and spawn in when there is water. And then in the summertime, once the snowpack recedes, there's not enough water to feed the stream all year long. So part of this is due to like a long history of human land use, and in this case specifically logging. So logging has taken out a lot of the large trees that help support the riverbanks, and over time there's been some erosion and material will fill in, and you get sort of an elevated riverbed where in the summer, if there's not enough flow, the water will just drop out underneath and go subsurface. And so you end up with these really skinny, isolated pools, areas where juvenile bull trout will get stranded. So again, we go out at night because bull trout are nocturnal, and we catch them with little nets. And sometimes it can be challenging because they will dart around and go in between the rocks, and they don't know what's good for them. So they just try to get away. But we do our best to try to catch as many as we can. And in this event, we actually catch all the fish that we find that are stranded in these pools. So we're not just after bull trout, but we're rescuing sculpin, we're rescuing rainbow trout, cutthroat, kokanee, whatever we find that's alive, we try to give it a second chance. And then those bull trout that are rescued from these dewatering streams, some of them get put way upstream where the water is consistently flowing year round. And then some of them are being taken back to a facility that's operated by Yakima Nation biologists to help raise them in captivity. And this is a sort of a new program. We're kind of testing out how these fish are doing once they're released. But it's really exciting because we're saving a bunch of fish that would not have made it. And we take them back to the rearing facility and hold on to them for about a year. And those fish in that time grow from about an inch long to 9-10 inch long fish. And so that definitely gives them a bigger chance of survival. And you can see in this picture, there's some habitat features like cinder blocks and PVC pipes that the fish like to hide in. And when they're really small, they get fed little shrimp and other little insect type things. And once they get bigger, they start to get fed rainbow trout fry. So in the top left corner of the picture, you can see a little school of rainbow trout that were dumped in, and now it's a feeding frenzy. And this bull trout down in the bottom has something in its mouth. Those trout fry don't last very long in that tank, I'll tell you that. And then once those fish have been in there for about a year, every fish gets measured. Every fish gets a PIT tag, which is short for passive integrated transponder. And it's essentially a microchip. It's like what you put in your pet. So these tags are just a unique identifying code that help us keep track of bull trout over time. And earlier when I showed you the picture of the antenna, when a fish passes over or through one of those areas, there's a little reader box that just records the time and the code of the fish. So it helps us keep track of what these fish are doing as they move throughout our landscape. And then a couple of those fish, the ones that are big enough, are getting acoustic tags. And acoustic tags are really different because they actually emit a unique sound code, and those codes get picked up in a lake by an array of acoustic receivers. So these tags are quite a bit bigger. They actually have to get surgically implanted in the fish, and then the fish get sutured up with stitches, but then they're released in the lake. And there's U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is doing an ongoing study to understand how these fish use lake habitat, and in this case, it's a reservoir. It's operated by the Bureau of Reclamation. So part of tracking these fish and understanding their movements hopefully will go towards informing reservoir management into the future. Here's some quick maps that I made for my master's thesis project. I was studying bull trout in Cochise Lake using acoustic telemetry, and these are maps of 8 individual fish's home ranges. So you can see in the each map is an outline of Cochise Lake. The white dots are where acoustic receivers were located, and then the white lines around an area is essentially the total home range of the fish, so everywhere that they experienced throughout the lake. And then the yellow spots are sort of the hot spots where those fish were detected the most. So you can see here, even just at first glance, all these fish are acting differently in some way. Some prefer a very small range, some have quite a large range that takes them throughout the lake. So I'm not going to go too deep into that and interpreting those results here, but it's interesting information, and some of the new science that we have going, like Alex said, is going to help hopefully recover populations. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is also running an adult trap and haul program. So Alex did mention that many of our bull trout exist above water storage reservoirs, and these ones that I have circled here are dams that bull trout exist upstream of. And unfortunately, sometimes bull trout will get washed out below the dams, and those fish have no chance of spawning and reproduction if they don't get back over the dam. So U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is trying to catch those fish and move them back to where they belong. And we do that using nets or by fishing for them. And once those fish are captured below a dam, they'll get measured so that we have an idea of growth if we ever catch them again. And they get a PIT tag. So every bull trout we ever actually get our hands on pretty much always gets a PIT tag, so we can try to track it into the future. We also take genetic samples on these fish once they're captured. And the reason that we do that is because, for example, down here in the Tieton area, we have 3 populations of fish, and the genetic sample can tell us exactly which population the fish belongs to. So we have a South Fork Tieton population, and then an Indian Creek population, and then there's another small dam called Clear Lake Dam that above Clear Lake Dam is the North Fork Tieton population. So when fish are captured below Clear Lake Dam, they get put into a little cage and they're left there for about 24 hours until genetic results come back. And if the results tell us that it's a North Fork Tieton bull trout, then it gets moved over the dam. But if it's a Indian Creek bull trout, it just made its way up and it's hanging out below Clear Lake Dam for no good reason. So we let it go back, and it can go back up to Indian Creek if it wants to. So that's a really cool program, and tagging all those fish allows us to monitor them into the future. So here's just another photo of another pit tag antenna that U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has put into a stream. And then we're also attempting a lot of habitat restoration projects. So one of the things that we've learned in recent years is that large wood and logs are really good for fish habitat in streams. So that means picking up logs with helicopters and dropping them into the river. And so here's a photo of a Chinook helicopter bringing some logs to drop into the North Fork Teanaway River. And logs and streams provide habitat in several different ways. And when you put logs in streams, it helps the water scour underneath, which creates pools for fish to hide in. It helps recruit different kinds of sediment. So sometimes we get fines recruited where that is a really good substrate for new vegetation to colonize, which helps provide shade to the stream, which is really important for temperature. We also get recruitment of larger gravel sizes that help, larger and smaller gravel sizes that fish need for spawning. And so overall, there are so many benefits to adding wood into the streams, especially because a long time ago, we had a lot of logging that took out some of the big wood that was in the area that would have naturally recruited into the stream. So now we're trying to put wood in to help recreate a sort of natural environment. And then in places in the upper Yakima Basin where we are experiencing that dewatering, there's some really exciting restoration projects in the works to restore flow to these habitats. So this photo is from Cochise River, and it was taken in June of 2020. So already by June, the snow had melted enough that there wasn't enough flow to connect the reservoir to this bull trout spawning stream. And we have a really exciting project. It's going to start getting implemented this summer to help restore Cochise River, reconnect the groundwater and the floodplain, and bring in lots of large wood. And so we're really excited to help this population bounce back. And now we get to the fun stuff, the even more fun stuff. It's all fun, I know. But as a group, we also work on demographic surveys and other population surveys. So these are mostly all implemented by Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. And demographic surveys are essentially when we snorkel in the river at night to count juvenile bull trout. And not only do we see juveniles, occasionally we'll see a big adult bull trout, and we see lots of other fish too. So we keep track of everything we see, and that way we get a good idea of what is going on with the ecosystem. And this section of the presentation, I have a lot more pictures to share because it's quite an adventure. We also do bull trout spawning surveys. So Alex mentioned before that Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife has been keeping track of bull trout since the 1980s, and spawning surveys are a huge part of that. And what we do is we go out and we count the number of reds in a stream. A red is essentially the nest that a bull trout makes, and all the other species of trout and salmon also make reds to lay their eggs. So what they do is the female will take her tail and excavate part of the gravel, lay her eggs, and then move forward and excavate even more to cover up the eggs. And that just helps protect them throughout the winter time. It helps keep them nice and oxygenated through the gravel. And this is what it looks like in a stream. So here we have 2 bull trout paired up on a red, and it's really exciting when we get to see that in person. This is a picture of a stream in a place where commercial logging has never occurred. This is in old growth forest, and it's in one of our best spawning populations of bull trout, where one of the best spawning populations exist. So walking upstream in this kind of conditions with all these logs can be physically challenging at times, but it's super rewarding to see a lot of fish in there doing what they do best in sort of the most natural of environment that we see these days. And I think spawning surveys are a time of year that we all look forward to as bull trout biologists, because we get to experience some of the most beautiful places. And this is just one example. And bull trout are pretty strong-bodied, large fish, so they have no problem navigating these kinds of little cascades that we find all around in the spawning streams. And then finally, a picture of a waterfall, because bull trout pretty much always end up at waterfalls as the end of their road. Waterfalls are fish passage barriers for the most part, and most spawning surveys that we implement here in the Yakima Basin end at a waterfall. So it's never a bad day when you walk upstream and see a waterfall. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about eDNA. eDNA is short for environmental DNA. It's sort of a newer technology that's taking a hold in the scientific community. And it's essentially a way of confirming presence or absence of a species. And what happens is pretty much any animal or plant can shed DNA into the environment. So that might be poop, it might be fish slime, it might be scales that fall off into the water. And so we go out and we use a pump system that filters 5 liters of water onto through a filter, and then that filter gets sent off to a lab for analysis, which I don't know a whole ton about, but basically we get a result that says, yes, there are bull trout here, or no, there's absolutely no bull trout here. And sometimes it's not that cut and dry, but usually it is. And so it's really exciting to be able to understand if bull trout are expanding range and moving into places we did not know that they existed before, or finding new pockets of areas where bull trout might have been the entire time, but we just didn't know it. And a lot of these places are a lot more remote because we have a pretty good idea of where the bull trout are in terms of what's accessible by truck. But when it comes to getting on foot and getting out in the backcountry, eDNA missions are quite the adventure. And with that, I will pass it back to Alex to talk about where we're going next. And Alex, you're on mute. Just wanted to let you know.
Now I am back, and forgive me the way we set it up. I thought I was going to jump to the end of Aimee's presentations. One sec. Well, you all get a subliminal reinforcement of her messages. All right, so when you take all that data from those red surveys and add it up, since this is from the mid-90s, we have earlier surveys, but 96 is around the first time where we had surveys going on consistently in all of our occupied areas. This is the trend you see. These are reds observed. We may miss a few reds, and let's just very crudely call it 2 fish per red. So you can double it if you want a number of fish. What you can see is we have some areas with a lot more bull trout. The Rimrock Lake and the tributaries that drain into it, South and North Fork Tieton Rivers and Indian Creek have been our stronghold along with Deep Creek. And you've seen there's been some bouncing up and down. This 0 means there was a forest fire and no one could go out and look for reds. It doesn't mean it disappeared. But you can see even our healthy populations have varied a lot in their abundance. You can see the upper Yakima and the Atanum. These are small populations that are struggling. Trend is not looking very positive for their persistence unless something turns around. And then we have the Natchez fluvial fish, which again, we'd like to see better performance. They're doing a little better than the upper Yakima and Atanum. And remember, the Teanaway blinked out back somewhere in 2004 through 2006. So this is why there's a lot of concern about bull trout, both for their own sake and as a listed species that impacts how we manage our water system, how we manage our forests. How does this look when you put it into that bigger range-wide picture? This is a map, no screenshotting it, it's preliminary. There'll be a final report out from US Fish relatively soon. But this is a map looking at the relative resilience of bull trout populations. So the blue very high means they're quite resilient. They're in good shape. Their numbers are good. They bounce back from being things that push them down well. There aren't major threats. All the way down to black means they're gone. Red means they're pretty much on the edge of blinking out. Yellow is right in the middle. You can see we in the Yakima, we're in that yellow category. Some of our populations individually might be in the red, one of them in the black. Some of ours are probably the Rimrock ones, maybe Deep Creek are probably in the blue, but when you add it all together, we're in the yellow. This map has a lot of colors. If you look at it, you'll see though, these purple lines are those 5 recovery units. The snake recovery unit looks pretty good. All this blue in Idaho, there are a few drainages it's not doing so well. There's a mixed bag on some of the more isolated ones, but on the whole, it's doing pretty well. The state of Idaho is actually actively promoting the idea of separating this out as its own unit and then delisting it, saying we've met our targets, we're resilient, we're blue. You can see that that may not work for the Mid-Columbia unit. And then there's some places where, if anything, like this Little Klamath unit, it's all yellow, they're tiny populations, they're struggling. You might even see, if you considered it as a listing on its own, you might see it go from threatened to an endangered to a more critical listing status. So we are all together in this threatened status now. It might break out, but even if it breaks out, we're likely in the threatened status. And we have enough other areas that are doing worse and face real issues with increasing stream temperatures and declining flows coming off parts of the Blue Mountains that you can be viable even without all the core areas the way that the Fish and Wildlife Service recovery plan is written, but we're going to need the Yakima. So conservation in the Yakima matters. We're in that medium zone when you add up across all our populations, and we're going to need the Yakima to persist for the whole area to reach its delisting goals. So that's where we fit in that bigger picture. When you look now, that's now future conditions, where are we at? This map is just one of several different models, but this one is looking at where bull trout are likely to persist in 2040 under a moderate, which is now the main one people are using, climate change scenario. And you can see some of the areas we talked about, like the Clay Elm and Teanaway. If you blue, the thin blue means there's a 20 to 40% chance they'll persist, that medium blue rather. And the thick one means we're pretty dang sure they'll persist. We look pretty good up the American, not so bad up Deep Creek, pretty good up the Tieton, that whole Natchez arm. The upper Yakima looks more marginal. Now, this is just a simple model. This doesn't mean that this is exactly how it plays out, but we have to face the fact that we have some strongholds that are likely to persist and other areas that are going to be much more challenged by climate change. Currently, we're focusing our efforts on maintaining all of our populations. In fact, we focused a lot of big habitat projects on these upper Yakima populations with the thought that if maybe the restoration work can get us enough decreases in stream temperatures to offset warming, that we can recover some of the lost flows. But in the long haul, we're going to have to watch how populations respond the recovery plan allows the core area to be viable even if we lose a few populations. So now we're focused on saving everything. But we're going to have to keep asking, is this the best way to use resources? Are we seeing the response we need from some of the more challenged populations? Or at some point, do we move resources to where they'll be more effective? We don't have a clear path right now. And there's a real debate between maintaining a focus on all the populations. This is what makes bull trout recovery tough in the Yakima. And we got challenges throughout the range. Some of our populations are so low, we might only have 2 to 5 years to turn stuff around. There's still a lack of dedicated funding. We're seeing a lot more funding for bull trout, but it's still not a broad bull trout funding program. It's working with the integrated plan to secure funding here for one project, working with Surfboard here on another. So we haven't seen a sustained source of funding the way we've seen for salmon recovery. We're still working to understand what those climate change impacts will be, and they're happening already. What will they mean? And when can we restore things faster than climate change is moving them the other way? And when should we move on to other areas? Tough questions. And we're still working, it's getting better, but still working on state and region-wide coordination. You know, we have some bull trout populations where we've identified 30 million of potential projects. Is that the best place for 30 million? Where do we get it? How does that relate to priorities, not just to other places in the Yakima, but other basins? So lots of challenges we need to work through, but also a ton of opportunities. You know, bull trout, we can't call them the forgotten fish anymore. They might still be a niche fish, but they're not forgotten. Actually, there's been a ton of energy from a growing group of partners to do something for bull trout. Aimee gave you just a taste of how much work is going on. That wasn't happening 10 or 20 years ago. We're seeing big habitat projects. We're seeing the Bureau of Reclamation investing in fish passage at Clear Creek Dam, above Rimlock Lake, really just for bull trout. In the long haul, it'll be a great project for salmon too, but that's one of the biggest bull trout projects we've ever seen. There's a really big habitat restoration project going in the Cochise River that we haven't seen the scale of for bull trout before. So lots of good projects happening. And as Aimee's also described, lots of good science helping focus and direct our actions. We have challenges, but we've got also a ton of opportunities and a lot of positive energy. So I'll just end by saying the future's in our hands. There's still a lot of work to be done, but a lot of motivated and committed people trying to find the right strategy to do that work successfully. So we'll end there and just welcome questions.
Great, that was super interesting and informative, and very well presented. Thank you both. We will open up for questions. I think, Stephen, if you can unmute folks, they can either ask or put their questions in the chat and I can read those. Thank you, guys. That was very good.
Thanks, Mike. I actually got a direct message in the chat from Jack. He asked, does the size or length of bull trout affect the size range they can travel over, like in the Cle Elum Basin areas? And I will respond to that with, I think when the fish are small, they're juveniles, especially young of the year, they really can't swim very well. So that does affect how far they can move. And once they get larger, they will move much longer distances. But in terms of moving from one basin to another, like the upper Cochise, maybe down out through the dam and then up the Cle Elum, it's pretty unlikely. We don't see a lot of that kind of movement from isolated areas, in between isolated areas.
Thanks, Aimee. And Stephen has everybody set, so you can unmute yourself if you'd like to ask a question. And we do have a question in the chat. As a fly fisherman, should we examine an incidental bull trout catch for tags or just release ASAP? So, should we examine an incidental bull trout for tags?
Yeah, good question. I think that it's good to keep track of bull trout that you catch. If you do catch a bull trout incidentally, especially like in the main stem Yakima, we keep a sightings spreadsheet just to kind of know where these fish are. A lot of times you're not going to be able to see the tag. The ones that we are using currently are all internal. That being said, any fish that are tagged in the Cochise Lake area, those ones get a adipose fin clip so that we can visually identify them if we're snorkeling or something. So I think a good thing to take note of would be if it has an adipose fin or not. And if you are like handling the fish, which you shouldn't be handling it a lot, you should probably let it go as soon as you can. But if you inspect the underside of the fish and see if there's a surgery scar, it may be an acoustically tagged fish that we would like to know if it got entrained in the dam and washed down. So short answer is you probably won't notice any sort of tag, but if you do see anything suspect about the fish, let us know, please.
And they contact Mid-Columbia Fisheries? Is that
Oh,
what
yeah.
you're saying? Yeah.
Yeah, you can, I think my contact is on here, or if not, I can get it out to whoever wants it.
Jim, did you have a question? I didn't see if you had your hand up. Nope. Okay. Okay. I can't see everybody, so I'll switch around here. If anybody has a question, feel free to ask that now.
I see one in the chat asking about probable bull trout populations in Northeast Washington. And if you were watching, you might have noticed that regional map, there was a research needs area, which basically meant a big chunk of Northeast Washington where we don't really have a good handle on the distribution. They're definitely in the Pend d'Oreille system, including some of its tribs in Washington. There's discussion about a need for more eDNA surveys and some of the colder tribs coming in from the north side of the Spokane River. And other than that, there's not a lot of areas that either are known to have or are likely to have bull trout. That changes as soon as you get over into Idaho and the Snake System, or the other big tribs that go up north there, Kootenai and whatnot. So Robert, did it fight lively, or was it fairly dead on the line?
My question exactly.
Robert has a note about catching a bull trout in the Natchez, and yeah, that's one of the fluvial populations where they're wintering as low as the city of Yakima, or even we occasionally pick them up headed out to the Columbia. So that's one of the populations that moves around the most. He says,
and yeah, those Natchez River bull trout, they are migratory. They spawn up in the headwaters up the American River usually, and then like Alex said, they'll move down in the wintertime. Zoe asked, can you talk more about your research with acoustic tracking? I can give a little bit more, I suppose. Those fish, those acoustic tagged fish, the tags give us depth and temperature every time it's detected, and those tags ping every 30 to 90 seconds. So we get a pretty good list of detections that we can then analyze and see how fish are moving up and down in the water column, as well as how they're moving laterally across space. And we have found that their movements in terms of depth are really closely associated with temperature, especially in the summer months. Those fish go down deep to stay away from the warmer surface temperatures of the lake. We've also seen those fish making daily vertical migrations. So they will consistently move up in the water column at night and then back down during the day. We suspect that has to do with following prey, especially because a major food source of those fish in Cochise Lake is kokanee salmon. Kokanee are known to make the same daily vertical migrations within the water column. And we think that that's because kokanee are following zooplankton that make daily vertical migrations. So it's really a food chain kind of thing. And as far as how that research is going now. I sort of stepped back from that about a year and a half ago. So if you wanted to learn more about that, our colleagues at U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service could probably give you some more information.
Thanks, Amy. We have Mark, and Mark, I've written down your email address and I'll provide it to them, but do you know of any published studies for beavers or BDAs with respect to potential benefits for bull trout? He installs BDAs in Wenatchee and Entiat watershed streams.
I do know that there are a couple studies that show bull trout like to overwinter in beaver ponds, partially because it stays at a cool temperature or a warmer temperature in the winter, and it doesn't get that freeze that flowing water gets. So those beaver ponds will be an overwintering area for bull trout, especially obviously higher up in the watershed. But I've also seen bull trout spawning in beaver flooded habitat. So I think that overall beavers are good for bull trout, but I only know of one specific published study on that. I could share that if you wanted to check it out.
And I'll just add that in the Yakima, we haven't seen a lot of BDA works in bull trout habitat. And it's for one of the reasons is most of our bull trout habitat, these are steep mountain streams, incredibly high energy. They're really prone to especially those late October to December floods that will literally tumble boulders. Like Amy says, we do have beaver habitat often on side channels and nested in and around the higher energy streams, but they're not smaller streams where it's really easy to do and have BDAs and see them last. So far, that's not been a big focus in our area. We're also lucky that a lot of our headwaters have fairly good wood supplies, except for some, mainly, especially the upper Yakima ones where they literally skidded logs right up the creek. But except for those, we've got a lot of good complexity in most of our bull trout habitat.
Harry asks, are populations returning to the same tributaries each year, or do they typically utilize the same natal stream?
Yeah, they probably are even more site specific than salmon. They do stray, and we see that with some of the genetic studies of the genetic samples on the captured fish Amy mentioned, but their stray rate is lower even than salmon. And the reds, people who do surveys can pretty well come across a corner and say, I bet there's going to be a red there, there, and there. And 2/3 of the time they're correct. Whether those are the same fish or just areas that are so well suited, we haven't done enough tagging to know.
Let's see. Robert asks, as a beaver believer, does your group work with beaver recovery groups? And I can hit on this one. I'm definitely a beaver believer along with you, Robert. I'm working with Yakima Nation. Mid-Columbia is working with Yakima Nation, and we're working to reestablish our beaver capture and relocation program. So yes, we're working on it. Allison writes, would you be able to give a little more information on the work plan for Cochise River this summer?
Alex, do you want to take that one?
Sure. Yeah, the best person to talk to is Mitch Long with the Kittitas Conservation Trust. They're the lead for it. But it is a large-scale habitat project that's going to do a mix of large wood, of connecting some side channel areas, especially ones that have spring inflows. It's been about a 3-year design process, and it's going to be a really good habitat project to see. For those of you that know the Cochise River, the lower part between the reservoir and the bottom of the normal bull trout habitat goes dry early in the summer, and it may not be wet until October, even November. Those fish tend to only make it back up after the first rains. They're our latest returning fish. This project isn't expected to be able to wet up that whole dry reach, but it should help extend the reach that has perennial flow, improve the quality of the habitat, the pools, the cover, so that the juveniles that are up there will be able to persist further down the stream. And it's a multi-million-dollar project. It should be in construction next summer. And yeah, for those that hike up there, it'll also probably make a small move to the Mineral Creek trailhead. And I'm really excited. It'll be the biggest scale pure habitat project we've done for bull trout. And I'm really excited to see the monitoring of, do we see better habitat through lasting longer through the season? And do we see the fish use that shows that that gives them more space to grow?
Yeah, Amy just posted in the chat her email address. So actually I was gonna send who was it? Mark, I think it was Mark's email address to her, but Mark, why don't you get in touch with Amy, and then also Jim too. Jim expressed the same interest, and then she can
And
send you.
also, Jack, if you could email me as well, I want to ask more about that bull trout sighting in the Cooper River area, because as far as we know, they're not in there as of a while ago. So it would be interesting to know if what you saw was a bull trout for sure.
And Cooper and
Right.
Waptus, we have lots of signs. They might have been in there recently. There might be a few, especially in the Waptus, but the eDNA's picked up just enough hints to say we got to get back in there and figure out if there are any left in the clay alum system. Wapatus is the best candidate, but Cooper would be the next best cold water habitat there. The actual main stem clay alum's probably a little warm for bull trout.
And then just bouncing off that, Jack sent another question directly to me. Is there much success in trying to reestablish bull trout populations in river or creek systems that have no known populations or eDNA evidence?
That is an
Yeah, go ahead.
oh no, go ahead, Amy.
Oh, I was just going to say, we are talking about it. The project with the Yakima Nation, where they're rescuing and rearing bull trout, a potential future trajectory for that is to reestablish some of the populations that have been extirpated recently. It's still in the very beginning stages of planning, and we don't have a lot of details that we can sort of release at this point, but it's in the works.
It looks like our questions have slowed down, except for Paul, who's really looking for some opportunity in voluntations to help with summer studies. I love that.
Yes, Paul, we could use your help. We're pretty much taking volunteers for snorkel surveys, night rescue. We could always use help on rock dams. And we could also take volunteers on spawning surveys. So if you're interested and you want to come up to Washington and do some field days, let me know.
Excellent. Well, I think we'll let our speakers get some dinner tonight. I want to thank everybody for coming. One thing I do want to mention is on March 1st, we have our last of our speaker series, and that is going to be regarding drones in restoration. A lot of cool work's been going on with drones. We at Mid-Columbia are using them quite a bit, and there's a lot that we can do with those in restoration. So Ryan Ducknicker and Zach Zakovich from Mid-Columbia will be presenting, and that is again on March 1st. Don't miss it. It's at this space right here. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Mike, for being our lovely host.
You bet. Thanks, everybody.
And Stephen.
Thanks, everybody. Goodbye. Have a good night.
Goodbye.
Bye, Amy.
Thanks again, Amy and Alex. Great job.